Just as a reminder, you can visit us at thepandapod.com. That's thepandapod.com to grab our RSS feed, listen directly, and share PandaPod with your family and friends. You can also reach us directly via email through podcast at thepandapod.com. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Panda Pod. I'm your host, Rab, and I'm joined today, as usual, by my good friends, Jeff and Wiggy.
Hello.
Yo.
And today we're going to be talking about a new historical subject. I guess not new to you, hopefully, listener, but new to us on this podcast, which is World War II.
Ooh,
Um,
ooh, double war?
Yeah, and there's plenty of as I was saying before, fun stuff to talk about, um, and cover, and hopefully educate and enlighten ourselves, and also you, the listener.
Yeah, we're going to educate you. How do you feel about that?
Feeling pretty good about it. I feel like I'm going to be educated today too. I am not super knowledgeable about World War II.
So to kind of bring it back a little bit, I did mention, I think, on our Rome episode, like we were talking about how much we think about the Roman Empire, and I was saying that typically for me, I usually think about um, World War II, going back to potentially the Napoleonic era, and like when I think about things that have historical roots, that's usually what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think about that a lot as well. Like, I probably think about the World War II era more than I do Rome. And I said that I thought about Rome like 5 times a day, so you can only imagine. I'm stuck in some crazy history loop. But I guess that's what happens once you hit like 35. You just, fall into the category of either you're a dad who grills or you go into World War II studying, right? Like you have to choose one. Yeah,
That's your prestige class.
yeah. Mine's history.
You went historian. I went mystic. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, Mystic's also an option.
Right.
Like super hippie.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so Jeff, how much do you think about World War II?
Not very frequently, honestly. I definitely think about Rome more than World War II. Um, I don't know. I'm one of those people where I have to like see something or like something has to trigger me to think about things. I don't just generate random thoughts. Um, And I guess like the media and like the things I surround myself with or my algorithm, whatever, must not be very World War II centric.
Right. And this is a totally different direction than I was planning on going, but I think it might be worth talking about, like, why is it important to think about World War II?
Sure, yeah.
Because for me, one thing that's true about World War II, like if you, and I don't want to get into too much America stuff on this, but obviously America's a player in it, right? But I mean, if you think about like problems we have today politically, um, a lot of people, a lot of political currents would say that things were better during that era. I mean, obviously we had the Great Depression, but as World War II kicks off and the war economy starts, um, that's America getting out of it. And then, we have the baby boomers who, I mean, the reason they're significant is because they kind of got to reap the World War II spoils in a way, right?
Yeah, they did. I mean, the growth of the economy, and just the general uh, generation of wealth. The outcome of the dollar becoming the standard internationally, and like there's a lot about that they definitely benefited from just because of our involvement in World War II.
And even taking it a step further, a lot of people will point to World War II as like a definitive reason that America should be involved in world politics. Like, essentially, like it's almost non-debatable that like we should have gotten involved in that war and that it was a good thing we did. Um, and people use that as a justification to this day, for like the reason that we have to kind of be something we've talked about a lot, the world police, right?
Yeah, I think the problem that I have is, let's be honest, okay? Let's be honest about history in general and like the human race. Like, uh, as a country, you grow and become more powerful by taking that which you don't already own from somebody else. You get in a war, you loot the crap out of whatever that they have that's available to them as a people, and take it. And therefore, your economies are better, your people are richer, and that's just what happens when the victors of the victors in a war, you gain something out of it, um, which has definitely been a recurring theme throughout history. And let's be honest, the American economy was built off of our involvement in World War II. And I think it's unspoken, but it's said that in order for us to keep our level of importance and our level of living that we have, that the best way for us to do that is to remain the world's number one superpower.
Right, and I think I think it really does have its roots. I mean, World War II is where that kind of. I mean, we could talk about it more as we get to wrap up. I mean, probably honestly, let's not kid ourselves. We're not going to get to finish World War II tonight.
Oh no, no, this is going to be a recurring theme for sure.
So maybe it does make a lot of sense to talk about the what happened, like why should you care up front? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And you see America really emerging as something different after that. I think that's the reason, that it sticks in my head and why I think about it so often. If I'm thinking about something that is a problem today, I can kind of trace it back, not necessarily to a root problem in World War II, but potentially a root, you know, like good even, like if you trace something um back that far, like that's, I mean, if you can trace it through the 70s and all that stuff too, right? It's not even that big of a leap to get to World War II from there, right?
no, it's not that big of a leap, and you're right in that I do think we should start off with the why should you care, and it is very, it's still used in our political system, right? Like the history of World War II is very important to America. And I mean, and many other countries as well for different reasons, but it's really important for America because we're going through this phase of extremes in politics, right? We do have this Nazi like populace. We also have this very communistic um, populace, and they're starting to both grow in power and fight each other, right? And so it's very important for us to be able to say, okay, like there's lots of, there are some grown-ups in the room that are going, okay, we gotta slow down here. Um, there's a bit too much crazy going on, right?
Sure. And I mean, I think one big difference between that time and now is that we're not really in an era of mass politics anymore. Like, people getting together and pushing a common project seems to be kind of, dead in the water. Um, and like I think that's the main difference. And maybe it is making a resurgence, but it's like it's a whole collection of individuals. It's not people acting together as a group.
Yeah, and there's also the things fighting against it, which is we have so much information that's available now that we didn't have before, right? Before we just had whatever the government wanted to feed us as a narrative, right? And now we just have information overload. And so there's always something else to talk about, right?
Sure.
And that's a problem that they did not have, right? Going back to World War II, that was not a problem that they had. They had the radio,
Right.
right? And what you heard on the radio was, Hitler or Mussolini or like that was just what you heard on the radio, and that's the information you got.
Well, speaking of Hitler and or Mussolini, do you guys want to talk about some Nazis and get that out of the way?
Sure, let's talk about some Nazis.
Let's talk about the red eagle in the room.
Yep. So yeah, I think pretty much everyone can agree Nazis are bad. But that's a pretty simple statement. So I think it's worth investigating like exactly what most people mean when they say Nazis are bad. And I think that there's kind of two. I mean, I think that you can take that statement and kind of evolve it into, well, their treatment of people is bad, right? That's generally what people mean when they say that they were bad. The way that they saw other human beings was bad. They saw people as disposable and wanted to use them basically until they were dead. And you know, I think that's a little bit more meaty than just saying they're bad. But then there's some kind of sub categories of that. And the two that I want to talk about are anti-Semitism and Lebensraum. And I kind of want to compare and contrast those and talk about their root causes to kind of uh, shed some light on what those people were thinking and like what people mean today when they talk about problems that the Nazis had, like the problem with their ideology.
Okay, so I know about anti-Semitism. What was the other word you said?
The other word is Lebensraum. I may be saying that a little bit wrong, but the direct translation is living space. And that was the idea that the Nazis were going to turn um, Eastern Europe. I mean, they have some particular ideas on which countries, but basically anything they could get, turn that into essentially a colony where the German-speaking, you know, Aryan citizens were going to be on top, and the Eastern European citizens, a lot of them would be wiped out, and the ones that were left would be kind of like servants, basically.
Hmm, okay.
Yeah, so you had like this colonization aspect to it, which is just growth. And then you have this Germanization of it, which is like Rab just said, like we're essentially trying to eliminate all of the other cultures. We want them to be German. Um and some of the other parts of that expansion was they really needed like agricultural self-sufficiency, right? So they definitely needed more land. They wanted to be self-sufficient, and in order to really get to a place where they'd be able to do that, they thought that this expansion um, is something that they could use to their advantage to be able to do that. Um, and there's a historical precedent for this too. Like it wasn't new with them. Earlier German nationalism and imperialism had radicalize this idea before. So this is something that not something that, like Hitler made up. Like this is something that had always kind of been a legacy of German history, per
Right.
se.
And yeah, I mean, really none of it is something Taylor made up. And like getting back to anti-Semitism, I mean, that's a problem that Europeans had really had at that point for over 1,000 years.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, there was a common practice. in medieval Europe of because Christians were not allowed to give loans that included interest, right? Um, People would, I mean, I'm not exactly sure which people, but they would invite Jews to come into the country that they were probably just had gotten kicked out of some other country, and they would have them come there and offer loans and really actually kind of revitalize the economy in a way, right? Because money has to be moving around. Like they didn't really understand any of these terms in the medieval times. Maybe the smartest ones did, but barely anybody did. That like money has to be moving around to make an economy function, right?
Right.
And so they would invite the Jews there and have them give out those loans, including to the crown itself, right? And then as those loans became unbearable and they realized that they wouldn't be able to pay the interest back, and some may argue this is the plan all along, they would kick the Jews out and critically like seize as much of the wealth as possible that the Jews had built up, right? So they would basically send their populations into a frenzy, like whip up anti-Semitism among the peasants, get them to get together a little militia, kick out all the Jews, take their all of their wealth, all that they could that they didn't take with them, and that would kind of start the cycle all over them again with those Jews spreading out to countries that at the time were accepting Jews, but probably would turn around and do the same thing eventually.
That's
Yeah,
wild.
so yeah, the I mean this is the type of stuff that people talk about when they talk about historical wrongs, right? Like this is like part of that ongoing, anti-Jewish thought process that just permeated the world at the time. Um and and all the way back to ancient Egypt, right? Like
Sure.
all the way back to that time. Like they were constantly, they would go somewhere and try to settle and the people there would kick them out. And then they go somewhere else and try to settle and the people there would kick them out. And then eventually it evolved into the system that Rab's speaking on, right? Like they don't get a break, right? They don't get a break in the story. Um and let's be honest, they still don't got a break. I'm not saying in some ways or another, depending on where you are, it may be easier, right? But they still don't have not gotten a real break as a people as a whole.
Yeah, it sure
Sure.
seems like they got, maybe I'm completely wrong here, but I mean they were given like Jerusalem and all of that as part of like the World War II settlement or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean,
NATO, yeah, that's a NATO thing. Go ahead, Jacob.
yeah, I mean, it is more complicated than that, and it's also not. I mean, essentially, yes, that was part of it. It was also the fact that that territory was ruled by Britain up until that point.
Mm,
And so, it was kind of chosen because of the historical homeland aspect, but also because of the fact that, it was just not sustainable for England to be directly controlling all that territory in the Middle East.
interesting. It just seems like it's such a monkey's paw kind of thing. Like that is the land that they wanted, but it's such hotly contested land that it's almost like it's inevitable that what's going on right now was going to happen.
Right,
You know?
right.
Yeah, welcome to the current war.
Yeah.
Sure. And
Yeah.
it is worth saying, I think, that the idea to send Jews to Israel was a Nazi idea as well. That was something that they were thinking about doing if they won. So it's not like, I mean, obviously, yes, the Jews were owed something after World War II and all of the historical European anti-Semitism. They're still owed something, right? But it's not like it may not be the best idea in general to think about what the Nazis were planning on doing, and then even though they lost the war, still do it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also something that pokes up here and there. You know, and
Right,
we can even talk about we just a quick caveat. We can quick caveat to over like when World War II was over there, and I think we talked about this before. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union took their scientists, right?
right,
Like we just continued on with the things that they were already studying and the things that they learned.
right,
So
Right. And honestly, when I think about World War II, that is what I think about most when I think about World War II, is like how much we ended up benefiting from like the people that we poached and the technology that we poached from, the war effort in Europe.
right. I totally agree. I'm just kind of thinking like, um, I still have this crazy idea in my head that we're gonna finish and get to outcomes by the end of this hour.
no, no, no,
But
we
no,
gotta
I
slow
totally
this
agree.
down.
We benefited a lot from what the Nazis did directly and
Yeah.
indirectly, and I mean really
Hmm.
can't be overstated. And not that that's a good thing, not that it's a good thing that we're still benefiting from it today, but that I mean it's just a fact, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if had it not been for them, we would not have gotten to nuclear power. Like,
Or at least not on the same
and I'm
time
not
scale.
saying, yeah, and I'm not saying nuclear power is in like our nuclear arsenal power. I'm just talking about nuclear energy, right? Like
Sure. Well,
that in
again, we
itself.
stole a lot of their scientists for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it just depends on how much propaganda is in. What was the movie that just came out?
Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer. Like how much of our propaganda was in that movie? I don't know. But they were saying that we kind of had it beforehand, but let's just say for doubt that we didn't. And Jeff's right. We took their scientists and they told us about
Sure.
nuclear power, right?
Well, I mean,
So
I definitely think we were working on it. I mean, science was moving into a nuclear age anyway, but it definitely like sped things up,
yeah, yeah,
which
by a
like
lot.
war always does. Like
Right.
war is a machine that pumps out better and better ways to kill people, you know.
And then suddenly in generally like advances medical technology too, because people want to try to keep those people alive instead of letting them die.
Right.
And I mean none of that's necessarily good, but it is a fact.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, let's look at this. Let's take a couple turns here, right? So, um, I was looking into the weaponry of World War II, and this is going to go back to health stuff. But World War like so the reason that was used to spark Hitler's rise and the reason of for World War II was World War One,
Sure.
right? So we're gonna go back a little bit. So in World War One, the main big weapon problems were gases, right? So chlorine gas, mustard gas, phosgene, um, and others. Um, and so gas masks and the the evolution of gas masks were really happened because of that war. And so to your point, Jeff, like with the continued learning in healthcare and stuff, like it really does rapidly increase because of war, right?
Yeah.
Because not only are we trying to kill people as efficiently as possible, when they're not killed efficiently, we're trying to keep them alive.
Yeah.
so, so like just something to keep in mind. Like had it, we had the Geneva Convention so that we wouldn't use these type of gases anymore, but that didn't stop people from stockpiling them. I mean, it wasn't until like the '90s that most of the countries slowly started getting rid of their gases, right?
Yeah, that's
Right.
Like,
pretty crazy to think about.
yeah, like we just got rid of our last uh stockpile of gases, I think last year. At least is what they announced publicly anyway.
Wow.
Um so that was what? How many years was that?
I feel like that just tells me
50?
that they feel like biological warfare is the way to go if they're going to do something evil.
Well, I mean, it
Yeah.
definitely makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like nearly unstoppable and incredibly cruel and very inexpensive,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, they even improved the gas towards the end of the war. They even improved on the ones that they were already using to be more lethal and harder to protect against using the standard gas masks. So, let's be honest, it's efficient as fuck, right? Like, if your entire goal is just to decimate a population,
Right.
it's effective as fuck, and it doesn't damage the environment like a nuke would, right?
Sure.
Like, so, like, you could gas a city, and then the city itself be completely fine with no people there.
You know,
Like,
Right.
you're really selling me on these gases, actually.
I know, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it's terrible. It's terrible because all of the weapons that we have today that we would use all come with consequences of people dying in terrible ways. And it started with really with the gases.
And with
Like, just
automatic weaponry, which really came onto the scene in World War One as well.
yeah,
True.
yeah.
So speaking of things that we've benefited from the Nazis and technology that we got out of World War Two, I mean, I think it's worth talking about ways that they learned from the U.S. too. And a big idea recently has been that they kind of um, they looked at what the United States did in the West, right? Exterminating the natives there and getting a lot out of it, right? And that's kind of where um, not necessarily where Lebensraum came from, but why they thought it was going to be effective.
Oh, they were looking at the US and going, "Oh, look what they did it over there. It was great."
Exactly. Like
Okay.
that their idea was compared to Britain, which had like a colonial empire, right, and administered a bunch of overseas territory, that the United States was kind of coming onto the scene. And I mean, even before World War II, people knew that the U.S. was going to be big, right? But it was just that like they saw that as like a model. There's a bunch of land next to you. You grab it. You put your citizens in charge, and you use that to drive your economy, and like then turn around and dominate other places overseas.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Roman. It's let's go back to Rome. It's the Roman ideal, right? You conquer land, you civilize it, quote unquote, to your standards, and take everything, right? And that's what they were trying to do. Just take everything that they could take.
Sure. Yep. Um, and I think it's worth kind of thinking about. I mean, we talked about World War One as well. Like why World War Two had to happen was because of the outcomes of World War One, and I think we should investigate that a little bit more. But it's worth also thinking about like what caused World War One, and at least I think it's mostly because um, you know at the time of World War One, France and Britain and to some degree the United States were very successful empires with a lot of overseas territory. And, Germany had kind of just come onto the scene at that point, and they kind of felt like they were getting scraps when everybody else had a seat at the table. And that's not to say that like it's a good thing that they started World War One. I mean, a lot of people died. It's definitely not a good thing that they did, but they were in a way like the like they were seeing everybody else dominate other people and saying like, "Hey, no fair. We want to do that too."
Yeah, I mean, what? Why wouldn't you?
Sure,
You know,
sure.
I mean, England, Spain, France. You know, they're and let's be kind of honest here. They did always, like, when you think about it. So England and France fought and fought and fought and fought until they married so much together that they couldn't fight anymore.
Right,
Right? Like that's essentially what happened. And then they just became like reluctant, really good friends. And the same thing happens with Spain to a degree. Like they just kind of adopted Spain into the this coalition, you know, and it's not, and let's be completely honest here. This is the same story that's happened all over again with the current war that's happening. You know, a bunch of countries get together and decide that they want to be best friends and they want to create the rules for the entire world. And what winds up happening is you have countries that can't or won't agree to those terms,
right.
and then you have problems. And that's my what I would call very 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 rudimentary explanation as to why the Ukraine war is happening right now.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it
Um,
is totally true. Like you have somebody trying to say like these are the rules for the whole world. Somebody else says, well, I mean, that doesn't make any sense to us. We're the losers in those rules. Therefore, we must fight a war over it. And I mean, it doesn't make the deaths that happen in that war right, and it doesn't necessarily even mean starting the war was the right thing to do. But it's just like a simple calculation in a
well,
way.
it is it's human. It's human. Uh, it's just human nature. Like when you put somebody's back against a wall, they only have a couple choices that they can make,
Right.
and they have to make one. They have to make one, otherwise they perish in one way or another. And so that's what we come into. And like Jacob was saying, this is why Germany was like, okay, this isn't going to work for us because we're not self sufficient. We don't have this money and taxes coming in from places that aren't just here, and we're a people of pride.
Right. They saw. I mean, they basically looked into the future and said like, if we don't go to war, we're going to one day be the colonial servants of England and France too.
Yeah, and it very well could have happened had the war not
Sure.
occurred.
I mean, and ultimately it sort of did happen because, I mean, when they lost World War One, they were forced to pay a massive indemnity,
Hmm.
and that is really directly what caused World War Two in a way, right? They eventually experienced hyperinflation. They had some extreme instability, and I mean, we haven't really talked much about Hitler yet, but I think it's probably worth going into it now a little bit.
Well,
Um,
hold on. Let me stop you for a second.
sure,
Let's go into that hyperinflation stuff a little bit more.
sure,
So during World War One, the German banking system um, had a problem, and mostly because of the war and financing the war, right? Uh, so there was one guy that who was the head of the Reich Bank, so it's essentially the German bank, right? And his tenure covered the entirety of World War One and the immediate post-war period. Um, and his policies effectively created the inflation, created problems with their trade, the devaluation of their dollar, and trying to fund the after war payments that you just mentioned, Rab, was all essentially managed by this one guy. his name was Rudolf Havenstein. Um, and if we want to talk, and then like to your point, going into moving into Hitler, the number one thing that he always touted was while we were at war, the people in control of the money at home was why we lost the war. That was his blame game, and his rallying cry in the very beginning.
Sure.
So with that, I'll go back over to you. I just wanted to
Yeah,
give a little
yeah.
bit
And
of.
so what I was gonna say, I think it's worth talking about the great man theory of history for a second. Are you guys familiar with that?
Mm-mm.
So
What is that?
the idea of the great man theory of history is that, um, you know, it's kind of like the default view that you learn in high school, like that people, individuals, drive historical moments forward, right? And that's really all there is to it. Most historians don't agree with that. So most historians, they are kind of more in the line of things that are occurring around those people kind of like produce those people, right? And then those people rise to prominence because they happen to kind of like have their finger on the pulse, right? That they say the right things at the right time and ride a like mass current in a way. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So I think with Hitler it's worth saying that, like, I mean, there definitely are some people in the world who like are powerful enough to have some level of an effect on things, but I mean, he's definitely one of those people who like happened to have the right, and when I say right, I don't mean correct, I mean like right for the moment, right?
right, yeah,
He was able to rise to power by happened to being almost like being in the right place at the right time, right? Like he happened to have the correct level of crazy that made people think that his way of getting out of their hyperinflation, all that stuff would work.
Hmm. Yeah, he he took advantage of. So his main gripe, and this is essentially just I don't. This is as I've learned it over the past 30 years, right? Like this is as I've learned it, and as I've kind of looked into this. There are. This is his main reason. He was in the army as a very, very young man. And he took pride in his ability to be in the army and be part of German society. That was his thing, right? Like he was an artist that wasn't any fucking good. He was, his there's lots of information, whether or not true or not, that his home life was very difficult. Right. And so he found like he had this place, and in his eyes, the Germans were winning the war. They were winning the war, but they couldn't win the war because the funding was bad. And so therefore, when he got home and the war in World War I is over, he is frustrated and pissed off. And essentially just started talking to people about how frustrated and pissed off he was,
Right,
and then started doing speeches. That's essentially how this began. Like,
right,
and other people picked up on his thing and started supporting him because they knew that he had built up that charisma by doing all these speeches and stuff.
right. And I think two things. One is that he's not the only one saying any
No.
of those things, at all. And the second one is that you know uh, what's critical is that he has an explanation for why they lost the war that doesn't really require people to like fundamentally self-reflect, right? You blame it on somebody else, and that
mm,
that lets you I mean, that's an attractive idea to people who just lost a war. That they can that oh, actually it wasn't your fault. The spirit of the German people is strong. That kind of thought, right?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and when you start you just start talking, you start gaining a following, and you start gaining, and I'm gonna say this in a way to make this perfectly clear. I am not comparing these two people as the same people. I am not comparing in any way these two people. However, if we take a look at some circumstances of politicians that we have today, very similar things have happened, right? So the first one that I can name is AOC, right? She came into the fold at a time where millennials were having a bad time, and started pushing back and making speeches and talking about how important it was to modernize our politics. And it
Right,
and she took off. There's another one, which is it's all about, this is, we're talking about timing, right? Bernie's another one of those. It's timing. He had the same rhetoric for over 50 years, and it just happened to take off at the right time, right? The American people started getting aware of all of the different types of corruption. The new generation was starting to learn that things don't really work the same way that we've been told that they're supposed to work, right?
right,
There's a popular meme that has the kid in a bill sitting on the steps of the the house, and it says, "How does a bill get made, Billy?" Or Billy's like, "How does a bill get made?" And the bill's like, "Who the fuck knows?" Right? Like that's the crux of the timing, right? And Hitler had the timing.
right. So, I guess let's see where to go from here.
Well, hold on, before we move
Go
on,
ahead.
do you guys think that a Hitler-like figure could rise up again in the sense, like right now, in the sense of like a rags to power kind of situation? Because like he didn't come from like nepotism or anything, right?
No, he was poor. His family was
Right.
poor.
Like, do you think that the world elite or whatever have successfully like situated themselves to a point where without money someone like that simply could not rise to power like in that way?
I don't think they have that control globally.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I mean, I think that maybe in the United States that might still be true just because of the like control over the media.
Well, the
Mhm.
party system, like
Right.
they've already shown us that they just get to choose whoever the fuck they want. Like
Exactly.
it doesn't matter. So
Right.
they've got that in the bag.
Right. So it would have to be somebody who's doing it through an unofficial channel, basically, right? And it's kind of hard for me to imagine, like with Facebook and TikTok and all the ways that people consume media, that somebody like that wouldn't get shut down before they
Right.
were able to succeed, at least in our context. But I mean, I do think that like if somebody was going to really oppose what's happening right now, it would most likely happen from outside of the United States, right? That it would be forces, it would essentially be people throwing off the like rising up and allowing their country to kind of throw off the yoke.
So do you think they'll be from 4chan?
I hope not.
You'd hope we would hope not. However, I think it just kind of depends. I definitely think it's possible. I think there's a couple countries right now where somebody could come from and do a lot of damage, if they were able to rise up in the fashion that that would that you're talking about, right? Like just somebody with that currently doesn't have any political power, but's young, that has passion and can tap into the current cultural waves of a country. And I think there are several countries at the moment where that could definitely happen. The problem is that most of the countries that I can think of where that would happen, those countries are currently poor. Um,
Right. I mean, well, turmoil is in a way what allowed him to seize the moment, right? So like there has to be turmoil, like bad turmoil, like much worse than we even have now in the US, I would say.
yeah. If imagine some way if Hamas was actually able to take Israel. I could see someone like that coming to power there in
Sure.
that circumstance. I could see that.
I just don't
I
know if
could
they'd
also
like.
see.
I
I
just
can
don't know if
also
they'd. Sorry, go ahead.
no. Go ahead.
I was just say I don't see how, even if they did come to power, I don't see how they could make as big of an impact as Hitler did before they were just squashed at this point.
Well, it's more difficult because of the video and satellite type surveillances that we have now, right? We can pretty much tell what, in a general sense, what other countries are doing, right? Like we can tell that just through satellite images and video and drones and shit, right? Like we can keep a tab on whoever we want to keep their tabs on. So to get to the extent that they did, they would have to, like, if you're talking about like the Holocaust, right? Is that what you're thinking? Like the damage that they did with the Holocaust?
No, I'm more just thinking about him even like
Just rising to
getting
power
to
and
the point
approval?
that a war like World War II was starting. Like even before the Holocaust
I
stuff.
mean,
Like
that's not that crazy. I mean, it started because he just went and took another piece of land over. I mean, that's not any different than what Russia did when they took over uh
Crimea.
yeah, Crimea.
Yeah, I mean,
Like
like if we are in World War III right now, we definitely wouldn't know it right this second. You know what I mean? Like it's possible
yeah.
that
it's
people
true.
will look back at this moment and be like, "Oh, that was like maybe Putin is a Hitler-like figure just in the way that he can affect the world."
Yeah, that's true. I think that maybe a single person can't do it anymore, but I think that a AI programmed by, you know, like something decentralized that can't be killed, you know what I
Right.
mean? Could potentially do it, like something that's just been fed like specific rhetoric.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's an
but
interesting thought.
yeah, I mean, you'd also have to have people follow the AI and
Well,
its
I think that's more
rhetoric.
likely than getting some like if you make it so convenient to use and it just like really subtly like changes the way you view things.
Yeah, I
Like
mean that's the concern. That's just the current concern with AI and uh the fuck's that called? Um like responsible AI, right? Like
ethical, like AI
ethical,
ethics.
AI ethics, right? Like that's the big topic at the moment. So that is a forethought, or some foresight. I'm glad that people are talking about it
Well, and
now,
it gets back to
but
the great man theory of history too, to some degree, because like, did did Hitler really do that? I mean, we
not by
have this
himself.
idea exactly. I mean, we have this idea of him as like a singularly powerful individual, but I think it can be, kind of argued a lot. I mean, especially if you get into like the fact that he was always hopped up on stimulants, like that is something true about him, right? And
Oh yeah,
he wouldn't be like that if it wasn't for the fact that there was like a crowd of people around him saying like, you have to be the one to make all these speeches, right? You have to be always fired up and energetic. And like if those people weren't there like whispering in his ear, I mean like he would just be a completely different individual to some degree, right?
It sounds like
yeah.
you're describing a like school shooter right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to humanize Hitler necessarily. Like that's not at all what I'm trying to do with this.
Right.
I'm more just trying to say that like everything that happens in history has a lot of people behind it, I think. And I
Sure.
think I mean I
Sure.
think the decentralized AI, like maybe people might still continue to look back and say like, oh, it was that AI that did that. But I mean really it was the people who built it, right? And the people
Right.
who
Yeah.
put it
Yeah.
together and did all the programming and all that stuff
Yeah,
too.
and that's a part, like the biggest part of his rise is the backing that he wound up getting from people who were in politics and did have power. Like they made the conscious decision to say, okay, this guy's got something. I don't think they had it in their minds that it would necessarily become what it became. But at the time they were like, okay, this is something, he's saying things that I like. So let's prop this guy up. At the very least he becomes a problem, right? And a problem for a current government and policies that I don't like is just good for me in general.
Right. Enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of thing.
Right, and so they prop him up, and it took a while for him to take over the Reichstag, right? Like he didn't just immediately start making speeches and all of a sudden he was king of Germany,
Yeah, he went to
right?
jail
Like,
first.
yeah,
He was
he
literally
was,
suppressed by the state. I mean, nowadays a figure like that, Jeff's probably right, would just get killed. But
yeah,
he was suppressed by the state and sent to jail, and that's where he wrote Mein Kampf.
yeah, and so like it did take time, and one of the things that I want to point out is through all the atrocities that he did and the things that the other countries knew about, the other countries were still very friendly with him for a very long time until it got to the point where Britain was like, I'm tired of you fucking with my neighbors,
Right, right.
essentially. Like Germany, like Spain, um, England, and America had very good relationships with him. I mean, he came to America, like met with the president, all that kinds of stuff. Like he was not just a guy who like out of the blue came out and started doing crazy shit.
While he was
Like,
doing like those like world tours and stuff, were they like actively trying to exterminate Jews during that period?
No, I mean, well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by actively, right?
yeah, I mean, yeah, it depends on
I
what you
think they had that goal in mind to some degree or another. They were certainly suppressing Jews from the beginning of the Nazi rise to power. I mean, Kristallnacht happened basically at the same time as the Nazis rise to power. That's when they go around like they send mobs through the streets, smash all the windows of Jewish businesses, stuff like that, right? And that's like the first big thing to actually like wake people up to the fact that you know this is real and it's going to have effects and and the fact that I mean, it's kind of the first success in that terrible regime.
Like, do you think that like America, when Hitler visited us, that we knew he was going to be doing these things? Do you think we
it's
had like
it's about specific times and dates, and I'm gonna go ahead and say that I don't know. One
yeah, it's
thing
fine.
that one thing that I will say, however, is that it was very early on into his rise of power when you remember when I was talking about how like he was blaming the finances of the German country as to why they lost the war.
Yeah.
He started saying that the people who were running the finances of the country were Jewish. He pivoted to say specifically that it was Jews that had caused the problem.
But I mean, that was like a world issue, right? That perception, like where in the world at this time in history were Jews like welcome? You know what I mean?
And they certainly weren't in the US because a big thing was that a lot more people could have been saved if the United States had accepted Jewish refugees, like
Right.
during the period between Hitler's rise to power and the actual Holocaust. If the U.S. had been more accepting of Jewish refugees, and I mean not just the U.S., other countries too, many, many, many more people could have been saved.
Right, because I
Yeah,
imagine like up until the camps and things started, like Jews were probably like, "Man, shit's getting hostile. We should get out of here." But like nobody would take them, right? Like,
yeah, and not to mention that there were times when we were friendly with him that we were specifically being told that he was doing heinous shit. And either for one reason of like we don't believe it because we're good friends with them, or we just don't want to believe it because it's gonna cause a headache. Whatever, like whatever the reasoning was, we did not act on that at all. And we were
mm,
being told even the beginning of World War II that this shit was going on, and we kept saying no, we're not the world police. We don't want to get involved.
Well,
and so that's why we didn't join the war in the very beginning. So
sure.
sure, yes, during this time they were definitely doing some shit when we were still friendly with them.
Well, I mean, it's worth noting that I mean, at that time and still today, right? The U.S. had, I mean, but they had a lot more back then. They had native people in reservations, right? And essentially, at first, the Jewish people were forced to go to the ghettos, and I mean, it's both of those things are really sick. But you kind of think about it from the perspective of American president. I mean, if they have Indian reservations and Hitler has Jewish ghettos, like what is the difference between those two things?
yeah.
Yeah, there's an always a nasty. This is one of my favorite two things can be true as true at the same time things, right? Like we don't. eh, A lot of people in America think we have this clean history and we have right to might, and but don't take the time to dig into the problems that we've had and the bad decisions that we've made along the way. And this is one of them.
And that's what like the Rome episode and this episode are really about, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the reason that you want to study history at all, right? Is so that it'll tell you
Right.
about something about the present. If it couldn't tell you anything about the present, like what would it be even before? Like, there's really no point in dwelling on the past.
Yeah, there's no point in doing it unless you can start to see unless you start to see similarities, unless you start to see trends, unless you start to see like the beginnings of mistakes that other people have made so that you can attempt to fix them beforehand. The problem is there's a couple problems. One, people don't always act on knowledge because they're like, okay, well maybe the situation isn't the same because it doesn't have the exact same markers all the way through. Right. So one thing starts to look like another thing, it gets a little fuzzy. So no, we're not going to act on it. Like this kind of shit happens all the time. And but it's ignoring history, which is the big danger. Like ignoring the things and not knowing this information and how it affects your lives is detrimental to the populace of the
Right.
entire world, in my opinion.
So this kind of brings us back to the beginning of the podcast in a way, and like, why does this matter? But also, like, what was the U.S. doing? And it brings us around to something that I really did want to talk about this episode, which is the sorry, which is the business plot. Are you guys familiar with that?
I mean, I maybe, but not
I don't
called
know.
that.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, so what the business plot is a basically a idea in the lead up to World War II, at least in the lead up to the U.S. joining, that the U.S. was going to like there was going to be a fascist coup in the U.S. and that I'm sorry, a number of top level businessmen were going to kind of execute it, and that they were going to use this to bring America essentially onto the Nazi side. Have you guys heard of this?
I have not, but I have heard of the infiltration and the. the propaganda and that kind of stuff. So I think I've heard a little bit of it, but not the whole thing.
So,
Yeah.
essentially, what happened is that a group of World War One veterans were hanging out outside of Washington D.C. trying to get money from their war. This is in 1932, so they still hadn't been fully paid yet. Um, and so a number of like top level military officials were, you know, kind of mixed up in that, right? So the idea was that these business leaders were going to get one of those people to kind of like get an army together, march on DC, and seize power for themselves. And the guy they picked was a man named Smedley Butler. Have you heard of him?
Good old Smedley.
The name does sound familiar, but I'm not sure why.
Yeah, his name is great. You'll see him quoted a little bit. Like you'll occasionally see like quotes from Smedley, because he became kind of famous because he turned down. He's the reason that we know about this at all. It may not have succeeded regardless, but he decided to whistleblow on it. And so he's a little bit famous for that. So you've probably heard his name before. But I
That's
just
so
love
weird,
the.
but he's not the first person that comes to mind when I hear the name Schmedley. I know another Smedley.
There's the Smedley from Rocky and Bullwinkle, right?
Yeah,
Oh, is
Smedley.
there?
Yeah,
There was one in Indianapolis. It's neither here nor there really, but it's just such a like specific name that it's weird that I knew another
I mean, you do kind of want a guy named Smedley to lead your coup,
one.
right? I mean, like it brings to mind. I mean, it's just the Rocky and Bullwinkle connection, maybe, but it brings to mind a guy who's like twirling his mustache.
To
That's
me,
totally what that Smedley in Indianapolis looked like too. He looked like Willy Wonka.
yeah, I imagine Smedley, I imagine like a gang, like more like kind of like a mafia setting, right? And you sitting there and you're presented a problem and you're just like, Smedley, take care of it, right? Like a number two guy. Like I don't imagine him being like the one to start a coup, but I imagine you having a Smedley, right?
Right.
Like you trust Smedley.
I can
And
imagine in a moment of frustration going, Smedley!
Yeah, yeah, especially back in that time, right? Like just being like, Smedley.
and that's definitely how the business plot leaders reacted. Nobody was prosecuted for it, um, and you know, it, they basically Congress decided, they believe there was no question that the discussion had happened, but that it was like kind of too upsetting, I guess, at a time before they were about to enter the war to start arresting a bunch of people for it.
That's
And
funny.
what's
It
uh,
tracks. They're
what's
ri-
what's
they're rich, right?
yeah, exactly. They're rich, so they get away with it, right? And what's notable too is that there's a lot of evidence that George W. Bush's grandfather, he was one of the primary like motivators of this. His name is Prescott Bush, and he's the dad of George H.W. Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush.
Yeah, I've heard his name a couple times when they were talking about that era. Like he was an important figure um during that time. He didn't quite have the pull of a president, right? But he was very influential during that time. Much the same as like the Rockefellers,
Right.
right?
He was a
Like
big oil baron in Texas.
yeah, he was very very rich and very well connected.
I mean, you got to
But
be if your son and grandson go on to be president.
yeah, that's how that works.
So, but and the reason I know that name is because Prescott Bush was also like one of the early members of the Skull and Bone Society too, right?
Yep.
Ah, yes,
It's
yeah. So,
all connected.
yep, no surprise there. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the other if you found out that other members of the Skull and Bone Society are the same people that Smedley blew the whistle on.
Damn it, Smedley.
Well,
I think that's a good leave point.
yeah, that's about where I was hoping to get. I think that's a fun cap to the end. And honestly, I think if I start back in on World War II, probably pick off where we kind of went off track, which is like what was happening in Germany and also critically Russia between World War One and World War Two.
Yes. I like it. All right, give us an outro, Rab.
All right, well, thank you everybody for listening. And as I always say, Hitler is bad.
Very bad.
I say that too. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely something worth saying over and over again. And when you're talking about the Nazis so deeply, it can't be overstated that you know they sucked.
Yeah,
And
they're pretty terrible.
that's about all for today. Thanks everybody for listening. I hope you learned something. Hope you learned something, Jeff.
I did a lot.
And we'll see you all next week.
See you
Bye.
next time.